The siren came first. Not the soft whoop of a passing cruiser, but the short staccato burst that means stop right now. Blue and red lights flared in the side mirror of a silver SUV gliding down a quiet two-lane road on the outskirts of Columbia, South Carolina. Inside the vehicle sat Mitchell Harris, 33, in a gray hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. She had no makeup on, her hair wrapped loosely under a silk scarf. It was Saturday morning. She was headed to the farmer's market before visiting her husband, Sheriff Aaron Harris, at the county training center. She signaled, slowed, and pulled over to the shoulder. The early light caught a thin mist on the asphalt. It was quiet enough that she could hear her own heartbeat. 2 police cruisers rolled up behind her. Not one, 2. The first door slammed, then another. Out stepped Officer Brent Wallace, mid-40s, built like a gym ad, and wearing a smirk that looked permanent. His partner, Officer Kayla Monroe, followed, one hand resting on her duty belt. Mitchell rolled down her window halfway. "Morning, officer, is there a problem?" Wallace's tone came out colder than the morning air. "License and registration, now." She reached for her purse on the passenger seat, moving slowly, deliberately. "Sure. May I ask what this is?" "About expired tag," he said, "and suspicious behavior." Her brows knit. "Suspicious how?" "I was driving the speed limit." "Step out of the vehicle," Wallace ordered. Kayla glanced at him, uncertain. "You sure?" "She step out of the vehicle," he repeated, louder this time. Mitchell took a breath, unbuckled, and stepped onto the shoulder. A small camera, mounted on Wallace's vest, blinked red, recording. He looked her over from head to toe, expression unreadable. "You been drinking?" "No, sir." "Using anything?" "No, sir." "Mind if we search your car?" "Yes, actually, I do mind," she said calmly. "I haven't consented to a search." That was when Wallace's eyes narrowed. Something in her composure irritated him, the steadiness, the refusal to shrink. He took a step closer, voice low. "Lady, when someone with a badge tells you to cooperate, you don't negotiate, you comply." Kayla shifted beside him, glancing at the dash cam light blinking in their cruiser. "Brent, maybe just write the citation." He ignored her. "Turn around, hands on the hood." Mitchell froze. "For an expired tag?" "Do it," he barked. She complied, calm but clearly trembling. Kayla sighed and moved toward the driver's side to double-check the plate. "It's registered. Tag's valid through December," she said quietly. Wallace frowned. "Run it again." While Kayla radioed dispatch, Wallace leaned close to Mitchell's ear. "You look nervous. Guilty conscience?" She didn't respond. She'd seen this tone before in news clips, in stories friends had whispered about after church, but she never imagined it would happen to her. When Kayla's voice came through, it carried unease. "Dispatch confirms registration's clean, license valid, no warrants." Wallace clicked his tongue. "Funny. Car looks too nice for someone dressed like that." Mitchell turned her head slightly. "Excuse me?" He smirked. "Nothing. Just saying presentation matters." That was the first line that made her heart lurch, the quiet sting behind polite words. Then, without warning, Wallace reached forward and pulled off her scarf. Mitchell gasped, stepping back. "What are you doing?" "Officer safety," he said flatly. "Could be hiding contraband." Kayla's mouth fell open. "Brent, what the hell, man?" But Wallace didn't stop. He squinted at Mitchell's face like he was studying it for flaws. "You look familiar. You one of those protest girls." "I'm a teacher," she said, voice tight. He chuckled, disbelieving. "Sure you are." Kayla tried again. "She's clear. Let's just—" "Not yet," he interrupted. "Something's off." He opened his patrol car door, pulled a small kit from the passenger seat, standard issue for evidence handling, and said, "Sit down right there on the curb." Mitchell blinked. "What for?" "Procedure." Kayla hesitated, but Brent's tone left no room for dissent. She sat down slowly, cold concrete biting through her jeans. Wallace knelt beside her, gloves snapping onto his hands. We've had reports of a suspect disguising herself, cutting her hair, altering features. Sound familiar? No, she said firmly. And you're way out of line. Wallace tilted his head. Maybe, but let's make sure. He pulled out a small electric razor, one normally used for suspect searches. He pressed the button. The buzz filled the air. Kayla stepped forward, horrified. Brent, stop, that's not protocol. But he didn't. He leaned close and with one swift motion ran the razor straight across Mitchell's eyebrows. The world went silent. Her breath hitched. A sharp sting bloomed across her skin. Kayla shouted, "Are you insane?" Wallace stood up, satisfied. There. Now let's see if she still matches the description. Mitchell stared up at him, speechless, humiliation flooding through her, like fire. Her hands clenched, but she didn't speak. Years of composure, of knowing when silence had more power than rage, held her still. From the corner of her eye, she saw a car slow down. A young man with a phone out the window muttered, "Yo, I'm recording this." Wallace spun. "Keep moving." But it was too late. The lens had already caught everything, the razor, the motion, the smirk. Kayla's voice trembled. "Brent, she's bleeding. You crossed a line." "Don't tell me how to do my job," he snapped. She resisted. "I didn't resist," Mitchell said, voice low but steady. "You just assaulted me." "Keep talking, lady," he sneered. "You'll make this worse." Then his radio crackled. "Unit 12, what's your status?" He grabbed the mic. "Routine." "Stop. Possible ID mismatch." Kayla stared at him, disbelief spreading across her face. "You falsified the call." He ignored her again. Mitchell's phone buzzed in her pocket. She slowly pulled it out, thumb shaking. Wallace barked, "Put that down." But she didn't. She tapped one number, Aaron Harris, and whispered, "It's me." Her husband's voice came through instantly, calm but firm. "What's wrong, Chell?" Before she could answer, Wallace snatched the phone from her hand and hung up. "Evidence," he said flatly. Kayla took a step back. "Brent, that's the sheriff's line you just cut off." He frowned. "Sheriff?" She said her last name was Harris. Kayla replied quietly, "This is his jurisdiction." Wallace's face went pale. "You're kidding." "No," she said, "and if she's who I think she is," but the sound of a police SUV approaching cut her off. Tires screeched, doors opened, a man in uniform stepped out, calm, broad-shouldered, presence commanding the entire roadside like gravity itself. Sheriff Aaron Harris. He didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for his weapon. He simply looked. "Someone," he said evenly, "want to explain why my wife is sitting on the curb with her face bleeding?" Every cell in Wallace's body seemed to freeze. Kayla stepped aside instantly. "Sir," he. Aaron walked toward Mitchell, crouched beside her, and gently touched her cheek. The missing eyebrow, the small raw line of skin, it told him everything. He looked up. "Officer Wallace, did you touch my wife?" Wallace stammered. She matched a description, sir. Did you touch her?" Silence. "Yes or no?" Wallace's throat worked. "Yes, sir, but..." Aaron straightened slowly, every inch of his posture radiating authority. "You just assaulted a civilian, on my highway, without probable cause. And that civilian happens to be my wife." Kayla swallowed hard. "Sheriff, I tried to stop him." Aaron nodded once. "You did right by speaking. Stay where you are." He turned to his deputy, Leon Brooks, who had just arrived. "Get internal, affairs on the line, and get Captain Edwards down here now." Leon's eyes widened, but he obeyed. "Yes, sir." Wallace tried to recover. "Sir, I thought she..." Aaron cut him off. "You thought wrong." Mitchell rose slowly, holding on to Aaron's arm. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She simply said, "He said I looked suspicious. Then he shaved my eyebrows to see if I was disguised." Aaron's jaw tightened. "Kayla, confirm that." Kayla nodded, voice cracking. "It's true." Aaron turned to his deputy again. Get a unit to collect every second of body cam footage from both cruisers. Secure the dash cam data. No one deletes a thing. Mitchell took a breath, steady but shaking. Aaron, I want this documented, all of it. He looked at her gently. It already is. Across the road, a small crowd had gathered, drivers who had slowed, neighbors who recognized the sheriff's SUV. Some held up their phones. Wallace realized too late what that meant. He wasn't just in trouble. He was viral. Aaron folded his arms. Officer Wallace, remove your weapon and badge. Hand them to Deputy Brooks. Sir, please, now. The command landed like a thunderclap. Wallace's hand trembled as he unholstered his gun and unclipped his badge. He placed them on the hood of Aaron's SUV. Kayla whispered, Brent, you're done. Aaron turned to her. You'll file a written report within the hour. Full statement, no omissions. Yes, Sheriff. Then turning back to Wallace. You're suspended pending investigation. If this footage shows what I think it does, that suspension becomes termination and charges. Wallace muttered something under his breath. Aaron's voice snapped again. Speak up. I didn't know she was your wife, Wallace said, desperate. Aaron stared at him for a long moment. That's the problem. You shouldn't have to know who she is to treat her with respect. A hush fell over everyone. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then softly, Aaron added, You'll answer for this, every second of it. He turned back to Mitchell. You okay? She nodded, voice low. Just cold. He took off his jacket and placed it around her shoulders. You're going home. I'll handle this. Kayla looked at Mitchell with guilt written all over her face. Ma'am, I'm so sorry. Mitchell didn't answer. She just looked at her, steady, composed. You could have stopped him sooner. Kayla's eyes filled with tears. I know. Aaron guided Mitchell toward the passenger seat of his SUV. As she climbed in, a reporter's car screeched to a stop at the edge of the scene. Eli Morgan from the local paper. Camera rolling. Microphone up. Sheriff Harris, is it true your wife was assaulted during a stop by your own officers? Aaron didn't answer. He opened the SUV door and said quietly, Get her home. To his deputy. Escort her. Nobody approaches that vehicle. Eli called after him. Sheriff, the public will want answers. Aaron turned once, gaze sharp. They'll get them, in writing. Then he faced Wallace one last time. You're done for the day, and maybe for good. As the second cruiser pulled away, the reality of what had just happened began to spread. Witnesses whispered, phones buzzed, footage uploaded within minutes. The clip hit social media before noon, 40 seconds long. The caption read, Officer, humiliates woman on roadside, turns out she's the sheriff's wife. By sunset, it had over 1 million views, and by morning, the entire department was under review. But that was only the beginning. Because Mitchell Harris wasn't just the sheriff's wife, she was the woman who would force an entire county to look at the face of abuse of power. And this time, she wasn't backing down. By sunrise the next day, the entire county had seen. The video 40 seconds of grainy roadside footage had already ricocheted across Facebook, TikTok, and 3 morning news broadcasts before the department's official statement even existed. A white officer kneeling beside a calm black woman, the electric buzz of a razor, and the line that turned blood cold. Let's see if she still matches the description. The woman's composure, the way she didn't cry, the single drop of blood rolling down her temple. Then, the second act when Sheriff Aaron Harris stepped out of his cruiser, calm as judgment itself. It didn't take long for people to piece it together. The woman's name, Mitchell Harris, was trending by mid-morning. Not because she was a politician, not because she gave interviews, but because silence paired with dignity had never looked so powerful. Inside the Richland County Sheriff's Department, no one was drinking their coffee that morning. Chief Randall Boone stood behind the glass wall of the main conference room, sleeves rolled up, jaw tight. The television on the wall looped the footage again and again, each time with a new chyron. Officer accused of humiliating sheriff's wife in traffic stop. Viral video sparks outrage and demands for accountability. Across the table sat Captain Joel Edwards, head of internal affairs, already surrounded by folders, body cam data, and 3 separate statements from the involved officers. Boone pinched the bridge of his nose. Tell me we have anything that makes this look less catastrophic. Edwards shook his head. Body cam confirms everything. Wallace pulled her scarf, then the razor. Kayla Monroe tried to intervene. Dispatch records contradict his report. He falsified the log. Falsified? Boone echoed. He radioed in. Possible suspect in disguise. Pure fabrication. Boone slammed a hand against the table. And he didn't know it was the sheriff's wife? He didn't care, Edwards said quietly. That's worse. Silence filled the room. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everyone knew how deep the rot went. This wasn't the first complaint about Officer Brent Wallace. Just the first one that couldn't be buried. Boone finally spoke. Where's the sheriff now? Home, Edwards said. With his wife. But he's been on the phone all morning. The mayor wants a meeting. Civil Rights Division, too. Boone exhaled, slowly. Then we better get ready for a firestorm. The morning light crept through white curtains, softening the edges of the chaos. Mitchell sat at the kitchen table, a mug of untouched coffee growing cold beside her. Her eyebrows, what remained of them, were bandaged with thin medical tape. She stared at nothing for a long while. Her phone buzzed every few seconds. Messages from friends, church members, colleagues. Hundreds of them. We saw the video. We're praying for you. You handled that with grace. Aaron stood by the counter, still in uniform from the night before, badge on his chest, exhaustion in his eyes. You shouldn't read them all, he said quietly. I'm not, she replied, just scrolling past. He nodded, unsure what to say. He'd spent years protecting people from exactly this abuse of power, humiliation on the roadside. But this time, the system he ran had failed in the most personal way possible. Mitchell broke the silence first. They want an apology from him. Aaron looked up. Wallace? Public apology. The county's PR team called. They said it would cool things down. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. Aaron's eyes darkened. No, not this time. No rehearsed statements, no photo ops. We're not cleaning this up, we're exposing it. She nodded slowly, gaze distant. Then let's do it right. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. I want you to file the complaint personally, on record. Don't let me handle it alone. I already started, she said softly, sliding a legal pad across the table. Her handwriting was small, precise, deliberate. Every word, every minute. Aaron's throat tightened. You shouldn't have to go through this. I didn't choose it, she said. But now that it's here, I'm not letting it disappear. Like every other story that got brushed aside, her words landed heavy, not angry, just resolute. Outside, 2 unmarked cars idled near the driveway press vans waiting. Aaron stood, adjusted his jacket, and turned to her. You don't have to talk to them. I know, she said. But I might. He paused. Then you'll have backup. Officer Kayla Monroe sat alone in interview room 2. The blinds were half drawn and a small recorder blinked red on the table. Captain Edwards leaned forward. You understand this is being recorded? Yes, sir. Good. Tell me exactly what happened, start to finish. Kayla swallowed hard. We stopped the vehicle for what he said was an expired tag. I ran it came back clean. But he said, her behavior looked suspicious, she was calm. Respectful, he escalated it anyway. Did you attempt to intervene? I tried, she said, eyes glistening. He told me to stay out of it. Said she matched a description. Then he grabbed her scarf. I told him it was out of line. And the razor? Kayla's voice cracked. He just did it. Said it was for identification. I froze. Edwards wrote something down, expression unreadable. You realize the video contradicts his entire report. I know, she said, staring down at her hands. I thought about pulling him off her, but I was scared of being written up. He's senior. He's done this before. Edwards looked up sharply. Before? Kayla nodded. 2 months ago, a teenage girl, same behavior questioning his authority. He searched her car without consent. She filed a complaint, it went nowhere. Edwards sat back, face hardening. You have documentation? Copy of the report, I kept it, just in case. He studied her for a moment. You're going to hand that to me today. Yes, sir. Outside, through the thin blinds, she could see reporters still camped at the entrance, waiting for a statement. The station felt less like a place of order now and more like a pressure cooker waiting to burst. At that same moment, in a small house on the other side of town, Officer Brent Wallace sat in darkness. His badge sat on the counter. His service weapon locked in a box. The phone had rung all morning calls from the union rep, his brother, 2 reporters, and someone from the mayor's office. He hadn't answered any of them. The TV in the corner replayed the same footage he wished he could unsee. Every frame was evidence. Every second, humiliation. He picked up the phone and finally called someone he shouldn't have, Chief Boone. Chief, he said, voice low. We can fix this. You know how these things go. She's the sheriff's wife, yeah. But if we say it was a misunderstanding. Boone cut him off. Don't call me again, Wallace. You're on administrative leave. Internal Affairs runs this now. Chief, please. It's done, Boone said coldly. You made your choice when you turned. That razor on her. You didn't just humiliate a woman, you embarrassed the badge. There's no coming back from that. The line went dead. Wallace dropped the phone. For the first time in 20 years, he felt fear that didn't come from facing a suspect. It came from knowing he'd destroyed himself. By noon, the press conference was set. A podium outside the sheriff's department, microphones lined up like weapons waiting to fire. Reporters filled the small lot. TV trucks idled. Drones hovered. Sheriff Aaron Harris stepped out of the front doors, followed by Captain Edwards and Chief Boone. His expression was calm, but unyielding. The uniform fit like armor today. He didn't start with greetings. Yesterday morning, one of my deputies conducted a traffic stop that violated every principle this badge stands for. Cameras clicked furiously. That deputy not only falsified records but humiliated a citizen without cause. That citizen happens to be my wife, but this investigation would be just as aggressive if she were a stranger. A reporter shouted, Sheriff, is the officer being charged? He's been suspended without pay, pending termination and criminal review by Internal Affairs. Another called out, Do you believe this reflects systemic issues in your department? Aaron didn't flinch. I believe it reflects the danger of letting arrogance replace duty. That ends today. And then, before he turned away, he added one more line, short, clean, devastating. Respect shouldn't depend on who you're married to. That line hit every front page before sunset. While the county buzzed, Mitchell stayed home. She didn't post statements. She didn't appear beside her husband at the podium. Instead, she sat at her desk, scrolling through an old file folder labeled Community Outreach Proposals Projects. She'd once pitched to the sheriff's office to improve civilian-police relations. Most had been shelved, ignored, or budget pending. Now those same documents looked different. At 3:12 p.m., she opened her laptop and began typing an email addressed to Captain Joel Edwards, Chief Boone, and Mayor Linda Reynolds. The subject line read, Reform Initiative Civilian Oversight Proposal. Her opening line was simple. I'm not writing this as a victim. I'm writing as someone who refuses to stay silent while the same system keeps breaking. She attached the draft's 10 pages outlining community accountability boards, mandatory empathy training, and transparent complaint follow-ups. Then she clicked send. The message was time-stamped exactly 1 minute before the county council went into emergency session. Mayor Linda Reynolds looked weary as she entered the chamber. Cameras were banned from this meeting, but nothing about it felt private anymore. We're bleeding reputation, she said bluntly. If we don't get ahead of this, the state will. Chief Boone leaned forward. The sheriff's already taking action. The sheriff's wife just submitted a civilian oversight plan, she countered. And it's better written than half our policy drafts. Boone blinked. She did what? Reynolds slid a copy of the email across the table. If we have any sense, we'll endorse it, Councilman Reed muttered. You're suggesting we let the sheriff's wife rewrite departmental oversight? I'm suggesting, Reynolds replied, that we stop pretending the public will forgive us without proof we've changed. Boone leaned back, thinking. It's radical. But if the sheriff backs it, Reynolds finished his thought. Then it's unstoppable. By nightfall, hashtags had already formed. Justice for Mitchell. Y'are not just the sheriff's wife. Y'are shaved for standing. Up the clip had spread far beyond South Carolina. Civil rights attorneys commented. Activists reshared it with captions like, "Dignity is the new defiance." A prominent talk show host tweeted, "That calm, that silence, that's power they can't erase." Meanwhile, within the sheriff's office, junior officers watched the footage and whispered. Some defended Wallace quietly. Others said it was about time something like this got exposed. Lines were being drawn between those who believed respect was earned through power and those who believed it was proven through restraint. At 8:47 p.m., someone knocked on the Harris's front door. Aaron opened it, expecting a reporter or worse, another camera crew. But it was Officer Kayla Monroe. Still in uniform, still looking wrecked. "Evening, Sheriff," she said softly. "I'm here to apologize." Aaron's eyes hardened, but Mitchell stepped forward before he could speak. "You came all the way out here for that?" Kayla nodded, voice trembling. "I should have stopped him. I froze. I was scared of losing my job. I've replayed that moment 1,000 times." Mitchell studied her for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Fear doesn't excuse silence. But admitting it matters." Kayla blinked, tears threatening. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, just accountability." Aaron folded his arms. "You're the first officer to show up at this door. That says something." Kayla nodded once, eyes on the floor. "I gave Internal Affairs the report from 2 months ago. The other girl he harassed. They'll find it on record now." Aaron's voice softened slightly. "You did the right thing." Kayla turned to leave but paused at the door. "For what it's worth, ma'am. What you did staying calm, not screaming, it's why everyone believes you. It's why no one can twist this." Mitchell nodded. "Good night, officer." When the door closed, Aaron turned to her. "You handled that better than I would have." "She's broken," Mitchell said simply, "but at least she's awake." By Monday morning, Captain Edwards had finished compiling the entire report: body cam, radio logs, dash cam footage, and 3 witness statements. The conclusion was brutal. Officer Brent Wallace violated departmental protocol, falsified communication records, and performed an unauthorized physical action on a compliant civilian without probable cause. In layman's terms, abuse of power, battery, and dishonor of duty. He slid the file across Boone's desk. "This isn't just termination, it's prosecution." Boone sighed. "The DA's already drafting charges. Misdemeanor assault, official, misconduct. But that won't stop the outrage." "It's not supposed to," Edwards said. "It's supposed to start the change." Boone looked up. "You sound like her." Edwards smirked faintly. "Maybe that's a good thing." That evening, Aaron walked into the kitchen where Mitchell sat again, this time typing on her laptop with quiet focus. He stood behind her, reading over her shoulder. "You're publishing it?" She nodded. "Every policy draft, every reform plan they ignored. I'm putting it online, open access." "You'll get hate," he said softly. "I already did," she replied. "But this time I'll get heard." He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Then I'll stand behind you when it hits." When she finally pressed post, the message spread like wildfire. "They shaved my eyebrows to erase my dignity. Instead, they exposed their own." Within hours, the county website crashed from traffic. News outlets quoted her directly. Civil rights organizations requested interviews, and quietly, inside the sheriff's department, officers began signing up for voluntary reform sessions before they were even mandated. Aaron watched it all unfold with a quiet sense of awe. The same woman who'd been humiliated on the side of a road had turned that pain into policy. The days that followed felt heavier than any courtroom. Phones rang until midnight, messages poured in from every corner of the country, and every call carried the same question: what happens next? Brent Wallace avoided the news, but the world refused to avoid him. His name sat under headlines that didn't even need explanation anymore. Neighbors looked away. His union representative stopped returning calls. Every anchor repeated the same. Clipped the moment his hand moved. The razor flashed, and Mitchell Harris never blinked. Aaron Harris watched the broadcast once more, standing beside a muted television in the corner of his office. The reporters spoke louder than the law ever could. Mitchell's face appeared on screen, calm, framed by two thin lines of medical tape. No anger, no tears, just the silence that broke the county open. Behind him, Captain Edwards entered without knocking and placed a thin folder on the desk. Everything was verified. Body cam, dash cam, civilian footage, all aligned to the second. No gaps, no edits, no plausible defense. Aaron didn't open the folder. He just said, "File it." Edwards nodded. "Already did. The district attorney's preparing charges. He'll stand before a judge by Friday." "Good," Aaron answered. "Keep it clean. No leaks from our end." By afternoon, the courthouse, lawn filled with signs. Some demanded reform, others demanded resignation. Reporters shouted questions at anyone who wore a badge. In the middle of that chaos, Mitchell stepped out of a black sedan wearing a plain blue sweater and jeans. No makeup, hair uncovered. Cameras flashed, but she didn't slow. She walked straight into the building, flanked only by her friend Tanya Reed. When the first microphone reached her, she paused just long enough to say, "I came to watch accountability work for once." Inside, the hearing was brief. Wallace sat 2 rows ahead, shoulders slumped, suit wrinkled, eyes hollow. His lawyer whispered frantically, but the judge's tone left no room for sympathy. Bail set, license suspended, case referred to the state board for misconduct. As he stood to leave, he glanced back once. Mitchell met his eyes for a fraction of a second, not with vengeance, but with the quiet recognition that some lessons come too late. He looked away first. Outside, the crowd waited for her statement, but she gave none. She only said, "This isn't about revenge. It's about repair." Then she left, and the cameras followed her car until it disappeared down the hill. That evening, the county council held an emergency vote on the oversight proposal she had emailed days before. 10 members around a long oak table, 1 draft printed for each. The mayor read the first paragraph aloud. By the time she finished, half the room had stopped shifting in their seats. The plan was simple: public review boards, open complaint, databases, mandatory empathy and bias certification for every sworn officer. It wasn't written by lawyers. It was written by someone who'd been on the pavement. The vote passed unanimously. Word reached the press before midnight. Commentators called it the Harris Initiative. Some said it was political theater. Others called it the start of something larger. None of them knew that Mitchell had typed most of it in a single sitting, while the antiseptic smell of hospital gauze still lingered on her skin. The next morning, she returned to her classroom. The kids didn't know what to say at first. A few stared, unsure if it was okay to look at the bandages. One little girl finally raised her hand and asked, "Did it hurt?" Mitchell smiled and said, "Only for a moment." Then she started the lesson like nothing had changed, though everything had. Aaron visited her during lunch. He stood by the door, watching her erase equations from the board. "They approved it," he said. "I know," she replied without turning. "The mayor called this morning. They want you on the reform committee." She laid the marker down. "Then we make sure it's not just words on paper." He nodded. There was pride in his eyes, but also something else, relief mixed with respect. The kind that grows only after watching someone stand taller than any title. By week's end, the first training sessions began. Local news crews filmed, officers sitting in classrooms while community advocates spoke at the podium. Some rolled their eyes, others listened. One reporter whispered that the sheriff's wife had personally designed the syllabus. It was true. In the background, Wallace's trial date was set. The department released an official statement acknowledging policy failure and committing to transparency. The mayor's office quoted Mitchell's earlier line word for word. Respect shouldn't depend on who you're married to. It appeared on banners, campaign flyers, even billboards paid for by private donors. Late one evening, Mitchell sat alone on the porch, cool air drifting through the trees. A notification blinked. On her phone, an email from a young woman in another state. The subject line read, "You don't know me, but you saved me." The message told of a roadside stop 2 years earlier, a complaint ignored, a life changed. The woman ended with, "When they shaved your eyebrows, they exposed all of them." Mitchell stared at the screen until the words blurred. Then she closed the phone and whispered, "That's enough." Aaron stepped outside and handed her a cup of tea. "You're trending again," he said softly. "Let them talk," she answered. "Talking means they're paying attention." They sat in silence, porch light humming, a quiet peace settling between them. Somewhere across town, the same reporters who had chased them for quotes now drafted stories about reform and courage. The viral clip that began with humiliation had turned into policy, and the county that once apologized for its mistakes was now building around them a new standard. Brent Wallace would eventually plead guilty to assault and misconduct. The court ordered community service and the surrender of his certification. He moved out of state before serving the full term, but his name stayed in every database that mattered. Kayla Monroe remained on duty, promoted after completing the new training program she helped refine. She never forgot the porch conversation or the sentence that stayed with her. Fear doesn't excuse silence. Months later, at a regional conference on law enforcement ethics, a slide appeared on the screen behind the keynote speaker. It showed a still frame from the viral video, not the act itself, but the moment after. Mitchell sitting on the curb, head high, eyes steady. Underneath were 5 words that had rewritten a county's conscience. "Dignity is the new defiance." The audience stood without being told. No anthem, no slogans, just the collective understanding that something ordinary had become historical. And somewhere in the second row, Aaron Harris closed his eyes for a brief moment of gratitude, knowing the world had finally caught up with the calm strength he'd always seen in her. Weeks turned into months, but the echo of that morning refused to fade. What started as a single roadside encounter had become a mirror the whole state was forced to stare into. County by county, departments began requesting copies of the Harris Initiative. Some tried to rebrand it under new names, but everyone knew where it began. Reporters didn't need to remind them. The image of a calm woman sitting on the curb had already done the work. Every Friday afternoon, Mitchell received envelopes from strangers, teachers, nurses, even former officers. Some sent apologies, others gratitude. She read each one in silence and kept them in a shoebox under her desk. She never responded publicly. That was never the point. When people asked if she forgave him, she said she didn't carry him anymore, so forgiveness wasn't heavy enough to matter. One morning she arrived at the community center to meet a group of volunteers helping design the first citizen review board. The air smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. Flyers lined the tables, draft bylaws pinned to the walls. Tanya Reed was already there, sorting papers. "You really think they'll listen?" Tanya asked. "They will," Mitchell said. "They've seen what happens when they don't." They worked for hours, ordinary people trying to write fairness into policy. A retired teacher suggested an open-door complaint system. A high school student proposed filming all town hall sessions for the public archive. By the end of the meeting, they had something small but alive. A blueprint written by the people who had the most to lose when things went wrong. Aaron stopped by that evening, uniform still on, radio clipped to his shoulder. He scanned the drafts, pinned to the corkboard, and smiled. "You built this faster than any task force I've seen." "I had motivation," she said, half smiling. He traced a finger across the paper listing community liaisons. "You're putting citizens in the same room as command staff. That's never been done here." "It has to be," she said. "You can't fix what you hide from." He nodded slowly. The state attorney general called. They want to model this for other counties. She looked down at the papers, not proud, just aware of the weight of it. Then we make sure they copy the right parts. Outside, a light drizzle began. She opened the center's front door and watched the rain streak across the windows of parked cruisers. For a moment, she saw her reflection, no longer the woman, whose face had been marked by humiliation, but someone carrying the proof that change could begin with one refusal to break. News of her program reached Washington. Within months, a federal oversight panel invited her to testify about community accountability. The invitation letter sat unopened for 2 days. When she finally read it, she handed it to Aaron without a word. He read it once and smiled quietly. "They're calling you the Reform Whisperer," he said. "I'm not interested in titles," she answered. "I just want the next woman they stop to go home untouched." The day she flew to D.C., the airport buzzed with cameras again. She wore the same blue sweater from the first courthouse appearance. No entourage, no statement, only presence. A young flight attendant recognized her and whispered, "Thank you," as she boarded. Mitchell nodded politely and took her seat by the window. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Senators asked prepared questions, but her answers didn't sound rehearsed. She spoke softly, each word deliberate, describing what dignity looked like under authority and how silence, once broken, becomes policy. When it ended, one committee member leaned into his mic and said, "Sometimes the quietest voices leave, the deepest imprint." That night the news replayed her closing words. "Power isn't what you hold over people, it's what you choose not to take from them." Back home, the town watched. Some proud, some skeptical, but none indifferent. Her students saw her on TV and clapped the next morning when she walked into class. She laughed and said, "All right, enough of that math doesn't solve itself." In the following months, the department changed in visible ways. Complaints that once vanished were now logged publicly. Patrol officers began attending forums with residents they used to avoid. Aaron noticed at first the tension in daily briefings had shifted. People talked more carefully, less about enforcement, more about approach. For the first time in his career, he felt policy pulling in the same direction as conscience. Kayla Monroe completed her first mentorship session for new recruits and used Mitchell's story as a case study. She told them the lesson wasn't about exposure, it was about recognition. When you stop seeing citizens as suspects, she said, you start policing for the right reasons. Some recruits rolled their eyes. Most didn't. A few took notes. Brent Wallace's name eventually faded from the news, but not from the training manual. His case became a required example in every ethics course the academy offered. Instructors didn't mention him with hatred, just as evidence. The slide showed the time-stamped image, the policy violations listed beneath. The caption read simply, "What we never do again." On the anniversary of the incident, the county unveiled a plaque near the road where it happened. A single sentence engraved in bronze, "Every citizen deserves dignity under the law." Mitchell didn't attend the ceremony, though her name was on the invitation. She spent that morning grading papers at home, letting others speak for once. When Aaron came home later, he placed a copy of the newspaper beside her. The front page showed the plaque, surrounded by officers standing silently. Beneath it, a smaller headline read, "State Adopts Harris Accountability Act." She smiled faintly, pushing the paper aside. "It took one bad morning to rewrite a state," she said. He sat beside her, hand resting over hers. "And one woman who never shouted." She leaned her head on his shoulder. Outside, the same road that once ended in humiliation now carried the steady hum of traffic, ordinary and uneventful, the sound of a place learning how to move forward. In the years that followed, departments across 3 states adopted variations of the Harris model. Conferences cited her reforms. Textbooks summarized them. Students wrote essays about the Harris Standard, unaware that it began on a cracked stretch of asphalt with flashing lights and disbelief. When reporters asked her what moment changed everything, she never said the video or the lawsuit or the policy. She said it was the instant she realized silence could be louder than shouting. That was the heartbeat of it all, the decision to stand still until truth had no choice but to move around her. and though she never sought attention again, her presence remained in every briefing room where officers were reminded why restraint was not weakness, but discipline. The legacy of what happened that morning didn't end in outrage. It ended in instruction. Years later, a young recruit asked Aaron during orientation if the story was true. He smiled slightly. "Every word," he said. "And the lesson's simple: never let the badge talk louder than your humanity." The recruit nodded, writing it down. Across town, Mitchell watered her garden in the quiet dawn, the scar above her brow faint now, almost invisible. The air smelled of cut grass and rain. She looked up at the open sky and thought of the countless people she'd never meet, who would never know her name, but would benefit from the silence she refused to break. Years passed, and the story that had once been headline fire softened into something steadier: policy, curriculum, quiet reference in training halls. The Harris model became standard language in police reform manuals nationwide, taught not as controversy, but as common sense. Yet for those who lived it, the memory never dulled. Mitchell didn't seek the spotlight after the hearings. She returned to her classroom, planted trees behind the community center, and found peace in smaller victories. Every semester she asked her students to write essays about fairness. The children who had watched her story unfold on their parents' televisions now sat in her class learning that kindness was a practice, not a performance. Some of them wrote about police. Some wrote about her. She never corrected them. She just read every line and thought, maybe this is how change survives on notebook paper, one sentence at a time. Aaron grew older too, silver threading through his close-cut hair. Promotion offers came from larger cities, even federal agencies, but he stayed. "If I leave," he told her once, "this county will forget how it got here." He spent his mornings walking through the station, greeting rookies by name, asking them the same question he'd asked every new hire for years. "What does authority mean to you?" The good ones hesitated before answering. Those were the ones he kept. Kayla Monroe led the new Integrity Division, a unit formed to audit body cam footage and investigate misconduct. It wasn't glamorous, but she treated it like calling. Some nights she sat in her office reviewing old clips, each timestamp a reminder of how far they'd come. On her desk was a photograph of Mitchell and Aaron standing in front of the plaque that read, "Every citizen deserves dignity under the law." She'd printed it from the newspaper, framed it quietly, and never told them. Brent Wallace had vanished. From headlines years earlier, rumor said he worked in construction in another state, keeping to himself. Sometimes reporters tried to track him down for "Where Are They Now" segments, but he declined every request. Once a letter arrived at the Harris home without a return address. Inside was a single line, "I'm still learning what it means to be sorry." She folded it once and tucked it between pages of her Bible without a word. One winter evening, Mitchell was invited to speak at a university symposium on civic ethics. She almost declined, but changed her mind at the last minute. The lecture hall was full, students scribbling notes before she even began. She didn't start with definitions or statistics. She began with a memory, a roadside, the smell of asphalt, the sound of rain on metal. She described what silence feels like when the world mistakes it for weakness. When she finished, the room stayed quiet for a long time. Then a young cadet raised his hand and asked, "How did you stay calm?" She smiled faintly. "Because anger is what they expect. Calm is what they can't control." When she stepped off the stage, dozens of students stood to shake her hand. She left without staying for interviews. Outside, snow had started to fall, muffling the campus noise. She walked slowly to her car, letting the flakes gather on her coat. For the first time in years, she felt something close to forgiveness, not for him, but for the world that had finally learned to listen. Back home, Aaron sat reading by the fireplace when she came in. He looked up and saw that faraway calm in her eyes again. "How'd it go?" he asked. "They listened," she said simply, taking off her coat. "And they didn't argue." He smiled, setting his book aside. "That's rarer than applause." She joined him on the couch. resting her head against his shoulder. The clock ticked softly. Outside, snow blanketed the street that once led to the worst morning of their lives. Somewhere beyond it, a new recruit drove a patrol car, trained, under the Harris standard, making a stop with the restraint that had become second nature. Time made the story legend, but not myth. It stayed grounded in policy, in the lives of people who changed because one woman refused to bend. Every new mayor kept the reforms in place, afraid to undo what had finally made citizens trust again. Civic boards named scholarships after her, for students studying public service. Her photo hung in the training academy beside a single line from her testimony. Power isn't what you hold over people. It's what you choose not to take from them. Aaron retired quietly after 27 years in uniform. On his last day, the station gathered for a farewell. No speeches, no press, just handshakes. He cleared his desk, looked around the office that had once been a war zone of policy debates, and smiled. The department didn't need him anymore. That was the real victory. At home, Mitchell baked him a pie like she used to before everything changed. They ate at the kitchen table where the first press calls had once come in. She teased him about gardening and grandkids. He joked about writing a book he'd never finish. It was ordinary, and that's what made it perfect. Years later, a documentary crew visited to film a retrospective on policing reform. They asked her for a closing quote. She hesitated, then said, "The moment you stop defending dignity is the moment you forget who you serve." The interviewer nodded, eyes shining. She didn't watch the final cut when it aired. She didn't need to. She had lived it. On quiet mornings, she walked past the old road on her way to the market. The plaque still stood, polished by rain, flowers growing around its base. Sometimes strangers stopped to take photos. She never told them who she was. She just smiled politely, paid for her vegetables, and went home. One morning, a little boy tugged his mother's sleeve near the plaque and asked, "Mom, what happened here?" The woman knelt beside him and said, "Something wrong turned into something right." That was all. From a distance, Mitchell heard it and kept walking, the sound of those words following her like a prayer she never asked for but always needed. Time moved forward quietly, like a tide that had decided not to recede. The reforms that bore her name outgrew the county, then the state, until Harris Standard stopped being a phrase and became policy shorthand. Federal funding programs cited it as precedent. Police academies taught it to recruits who were too young to remember the video that started it all. Somewhere in between, the story turned from scandal to lesson. Mitchell never followed its trajectory closely. She spent her days teaching and her nights volunteering at the Community Literacy Center. Her life had returned to small things: chalk dust, library books, the soft creak of her front porch swing. The headlines belonged to others now, but the change she had sparked lived quietly in places she never saw. Letters still arrived from people she'd never met. A probation officer who rewrote his department's complaint process, a teenage girl who said she wanted to join law enforcement, to do it right this time. Mitchell read each one with the same calm expression, folded them neatly, and kept them in the same shoebox that had once held apologies. Aaron sometimes found her reading them late at night, her face half in lamplight. When he asked why she kept them all, she said, "Because every one of them means someone stayed instead of walking away." He understood that better than anyone. His retirement had not ended his work. He now traveled to different counties as a quiet consultant, helping them audit their own accountability systems. Reporters sometimes asked why he never sought office or higher rank. He answered, "You don't need a podium when you have proof." On his travels, he would sometimes meet young officers who didn't recognize him at first. They'd talk proudly about the Harris Code, believing it was just a phrase in their manual. He never corrected them. He just listened, smiled, and thought about the woman who made it more than words. When he came home, he found her in the garden, gloves dirt-stained, humming to herself. She was growing herbs that year, basil, mint, rosemary, and gave half to the neighbors who once watched everything from behind curtains. It had taken years, but the stares had turned to smiles. Once, a former critic approached her at the market and said, "I didn't understand before. Now I do." She only nodded and replied, "Understanding's enough." The town eventually named the new civic library after her. She refused the ceremony at first, then agreed when they promised it would double as a tutoring space for underprivileged kids. During the dedication, someone asked her to say a few words. She looked out at the crowd, at faces old and new, and said, "Education is just accountability written in advance." The line made its way onto school posters the next week. At home, Erin framed the article but never told her. They spent most evenings on the porch now, listening to the soft noise of traffic on the road that once defined their lives. Every so often, a passing driver would slow down to read the plaque still standing near the shoulder. Some rolled down their windows and waved. Most didn't know she was only a few yards away, sipping tea in the fading light. She liked it that way. Fame was too loud. Change was quieter. The world around her had shifted, but she hadn't. She still carried herself with the same composure that once unnerved an officer into revealing his worst self. The scar above her brow had faded almost completely. Sometimes she traced it absent-mindedly, not out of pain, but remembrance. She never forgot the morning when dignity became defiance, when silence became power. Years later, the Justice Department cited her case in a national study on civil conduct. Her testimony appeared in the appendix, stripped of names, labeled simply Subject H. Scholars wrote papers about how one measured response changed enforcement philosophy nationwide. None of them knew she still taught fourth-grade math on weekday mornings. The legacy lived without her needing to tend it. She found peace in knowing the country she'd challenged had, in its own slow, imperfect way, listened. On the anniversary of the Reform Act, Erin gave her a small gift, a silver pendant engraved with the words still standing. She smiled, put it on, and said, "Always." That night they sat together under the same stars that had watched their hardest day, the sound of crickets folding into the hum of distant cars, the past now just a landmark on a road that no longer hurt to drive by. Years rolled on, news cycles changed, names came and went. But the quiet legacy that had begun on that stretch of asphalt continued to ripple outward. The Harris reforms were no longer treated as innovations. They had become expectations. Graduating cadets recited the Harris Oath as part of their final ceremony: to serve with restraint, to lead with respect, to honor without condition. None of them had met her, yet every one of them knew her name. By then, Mitchell was in her 70s. Her hair was silver. Her walk slower, but her voice remained as measured as the morning she'd faced humiliation and turned it into reform. She rarely traveled anymore. The world came to her now: journalists, students, historians, even politicians. Some came for interviews, others just to listen. They always asked the same question in different words: "How did you change it?" She always gave the same answer: by refusing to become what they expected. Erin passed a few years before her, peacefully, with the same calm he had lived by. The town filled the chapel for his memorial. Officers from across the state attended, hats pressed to their chests, badges glinting in the morning sun. When they lowered the flag to half-mast, Mitchell stood among them, her hand steady, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "He protected people," she said softly afterward, "even from their own power." In the years that followed, she lived simply, tending her garden, hosting tutoring sessions in her home. The plaque down by the road had aged. The bronze letters had grown darker. The flowers around it replaced season after season by strangers who still cared. Sometimes she'd see tourists stop to take photos, unaware that the woman watering the roses nearby was the reason the plaque existed. She liked it that way. Recognition was noise. Change was quiet. On the 50th anniversary of the Harris Initiative, a National Ethics Award was created in her honor. They called it the Mitchell Harris Medal for Civic Integrity. Recipients came from every walk of life: judges, teachers, nurses, firefighters, anyone who had chosen compassion where power might have been easier. She was invited to the first ceremony, but declined, sending a short handwritten note instead. True integrity doesn't need an audience. The letter was framed beside the stage. As age pressed gently against her body, her mind stayed sharp. Former students visited often, some bringing their children. They called her Ms. Harris still, though decades had passed since she'd last stood in front of a classroom. They told her stories about careers she'd inspired: lawyers who defended wrongly accused citizens, social workers who built safer shelters, community officers who taught empathy before enforcement. She listened to every word with a soft smile, her eyes carrying that same balance of grace and gravity. One spring afternoon, she received a letter from a young woman in Minneapolis. The letter was short, almost shy. "We studied your story in training," it read. "They said you taught the country how to stand still without surrender. Today I stopped a car that matched a description. The driver was scared. I was careful. I remembered you." Mitchell folded the paper carefully, placed it on the table, and whispered, "That's enough." When she turned 80, the town council decided to rename the civic library where she had once taught adult reading classes. The dedication plaque bore her full name this time, though she hadn't asked for it. It read, "A community's conscience, planted here." She didn't attend that ceremony either. She stayed home, sitting by the window, the light falling gently across her hands as she traced the rim of her teacup. Somewhere outside, the bells from the courthouse rang, a sound that once carried fear, now ringing with quiet continuity. In her final years, she kept a notebook by her bedside. It wasn't for memoirs or speeches. It was for single sentences that came to her in the quiet. One page read, "Calm is not silence, it's control." Another, "Justice is a mirror, hold it too close, and you only see yourself." The last line she ever wrote, simple and unembellished, said, "Dignity is the last language that never lies." When she passed, the news spread slowly, respectfully. No breaking headlines, no viral videos, just tributes that sounded more like memories than stories. Her students gathered in the old school auditorium. Officers in crisp uniforms stood among civilians in jeans and hoodies. Someone read aloud the line from her notebook, and the room stood still. No one clapped. They just listened. The state declared a day of remembrance in her honor. But more than statues or speeches, the truest memorial was unseen. The changed pauses in every officer's approach, the tempered tone in every warning, the careful second look before every decision that could wound or heal. Her name was no longer spoken daily, yet it lived in reflexes, policy, conscience. The culture she had forced to face itself didn't forget the woman who made silence speak louder than rage. And long after her house had become a historical landmark, children walking by would point at the little bronze sign and ask, "Who was she?" Their parents would say, "She was the reason people think twice before they forget respect." The world she left behind wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was better, and in that better world, on the road where it all began, the flowers still grew wild around the plaque that bore her name. And under the morning sun, the engraved words caught the light the way truth always does when someone, somewhere, finally stops to look. Decades passed until her story was no longer a living memory, but a piece of curriculum. The roads were wider, cars quieter, and the county courthouse had turned into a heritage museum. Children walked past displays they didn't fully understand yet. On one wall hung the photograph that had once circled the world, a black woman sitting calmly on the roadside, a police cruiser behind her, her dignity intact even when everything around her had tried to take it. The caption beneath was just 5 words, "The moment that changed policing." A young student named Layla stopped in front of it during a field trip. She was 13, curious, the kind of girl who asked too many questions for her teacher's patience. "Was she scared?" she whispered to her classmate. The tour guide overheard and smiled. "Maybe." But she didn't let fear decide her behavior. Layla stared at the photograph a moment longer, wondering what it meant to be that still when the world was cruel. In the years since Mitchell's passing, her legacy had found new life online. The National Archive of Justice Studies digitized her testimony, body cam footage, and handwritten reforms. College students used them in ethics papers, Journalists cited her case whenever new scandals surfaced. The Harris Initiative had expanded into a federal code used internationally. Even beyond law enforcement, corporations and hospitals adapted parts of her framework, calling it the Dignity Protocol. No one who had known her lived to see it, but her voice carried through lectures and documentaries. Each quote sounded freshly spoken, never old. Every generation discovered her differently. Some saw a symbol of quiet rebellion, others a teacher who refused to bow to injustice. The recordings of her final interviews revealed the same steady tone that once unnerved an officer decades earlier. Anger fades, she had said, but dignity echoes. The simplicity of her words had become the foundation of entire disciplines. 1 century after the incident, the nation honored her legacy in a televised commemoration. The ceremony wasn't grand, just solemn public servants, educators, community leaders gathered under a glass dome filled with sunlight. A giant screen displayed fragments of her life: the classroom, the reform hearings, her small garden, the handwritten notebooks. The speaker was a young black woman, Chief Dana Vaughn, head of the National Ethics Bureau. She approached the podium slowly, her uniform pressed, her expression calm but proud. "When I joined the academy," she began, "our instructors told us we would learn about law, tactics, and procedure. But what shaped me most was a single video, an old clip of a woman who refused to shout while the world misjudged her. They said her silence redefined power. I say her restraint redefined humanity." The room fell completely still. Dana looked up toward the banner bearing Mitchell's image and continued, "Today we rename this institution in her honor. From this day forward, it will be known as the Harris Institute for Civic Integrity." Applause rose, soft at first, then swelling, like rain. Across the nation, every broadcast ended with the same closing line from Mitchell's notebook, the final one she ever wrote. "Dignity is the last language that never lies." Long after the lights dimmed and the audience dispersed, a single student stayed behind. Layla, again now grown, a researcher at the institute she'd once toured as a child. She walked down a quiet hallway lined with artifacts. There, under glass, lay the small silver pendant engraved "Still Standing." She pressed her hand to the case, eyes glistening. She had spent years studying Harris's policies, quoting her principles in lectures, but seeing the necklace was different. It felt like proof that courage could outlive flesh. She turned off the lights as she left, the exhibit bathed in a dim glow from the skylight. Outside, the night air was still. The old road where it all began had become a memorial garden now, open to everyone. No admission fee, no guards. People left flowers there, strangers who never knew her name until they learned why the world could breathe a little easier because of her. As dawn broke, the first rays of light touched the plaque's weathered surface, and the words, "Faded but unforgotten," gleamed once more. Every citizen deserves dignity under the law. Birds sang in the distance. The breeze carried the scent of spring, and for a moment the silence felt alive again, steady, strong, and eternal, like the woman who had once stood against cruelty and made the world gentler without ever raising her voice. Time eventually made her legacy something larger than even history could contain. Scholars wrote of her the way they wrote about movements, not people. The Harris Institute became a cornerstone for civic education, its programs spanning continents. In training halls across Europe and Africa, recruits learned about the Harris moment, a phrase that no longer required explanation. It was shorthand for restraint in the face of injustice, proof that integrity could be a form of resistance. Yet in every archive, every textbook, the photo remained the same. That calm woman on the curb, gaze steady, expression unreadable, defying the violence that tried to define her. Layla, now director of the Institute, spent years preserving that legacy. She oversaw the digitization of every document, every handwritten note Mitchell had ever made. The notebooks revealed details no one had known: lesson plans written in the margins of policy drafts, grocery lists beside reform outlines, empathy folded into practicality. "Never make people feel small just because you can," one note read, in her looping cursive. Layla often paused over that line when the world around her felt too loud. Technology had changed everything. The Institute now used holographic teaching sessions, recreations of past hearings, simulations of ethical dilemmas. Still, every orientation began the same way. A single minute of silence played from the original roadside footage, no sound but the hum of wind and the faint click of a body cam. Cadets watched in darkness, listening to what dignity sounded like when it refused to yield. When the lights came back on, no instructor needed to explain. Beyond the academy, society itself had bent closer to the ideals Mitchell had once written about. Laws required de-escalation before detention, empathy before enforcement. Even outside policing, her influence lingered. Doctors studied her approach in patient care seminars. Journalists cited her example when covering public crises. Business schools taught the Harris method in leadership ethics, describing it as authority anchored by humility. Her face appeared on postage stamps, murals, and the corner of currency bills in a commemorative edition that simply said, "Courage through calm." Still, there was something almost sacred about the quiet, spaces where her memory lived unspoken. The house where she had taught children to read became a cultural site, though it remained exactly as she left it. Books on the shelves, the garden behind it still blooming in soft disorder. Visitors often said they could feel her presence there, not as a ghost, but as an atmosphere of patience. On the desk lay a single object under glass. The original razor, deactivated, labeled only the instrument of consequence. Tourists would stare at it in silence, understanding the irony. It wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a relic of ignorance defeated by composure. Every year on the anniversary of the Harris Initiative, the town hosted a candlelight walk down the road where it all began. Children carried lanterns. Parents walked beside them. Officers marched, unarmed among the crowd. No speeches, no cameras, just footsteps. The plaque at the end of the path bore fresh flowers, the air filled with the smell of rain and earth. Layla attended quietly each year, blending into the crowd. She didn't lead. The event never spoke from the podium. She just listened to the rhythm of footsteps and thought how a single person's restraint had outlasted generations of rhetoric. Once, a boy no older than 10 walked beside her and said, "My dad says she was the bravest person who ever lived, but she didn't fight anyone." Layla smiled and answered, "That's exactly why." The boy thought for a moment, then nodded as if something eternal had just made sense. Back at the Institute, a new exhibit was being assembled, one dedicated not to tragedy, but to reform as living art. The final installation was a holographic recreation of the moment Mitchell stood before the Senate decades earlier. When it played, the hall filled with her voice again. Calm, measured, deliberate. "Power isn't what you hold over people," she said, her hologram shimmering in the half-light. "It's what you choose not to take from them." The crowd watching always rose to its feet in silence when the projection faded. On the centennial of her birth, the president delivered a national address. For the first time in decades, the speech opened not with applause, but with quiet, a tradition established in her honor. "She did not shout," the president said. "She did not threaten. She reminded us that the truest strength is mercy, and that the hardest thing to master is restraint." The speech ended with a call that became an oath for a new age. "May we always meet anger with steadiness, prejudice with patience, and power with grace." That night, across the world, people replayed the original clip on whatever devices existed then, marveling not at its tragedy but its precision. The way she looked up after being wronged. The way she said nothing. The silence that once felt heavy now felt like instruction. Generations later, school children learning about early reform movements didn't memorize dates or officers' names. They learned one phrase that had never faded from public consciousness, the Harris Principle. It was written into civic codes, moral charters, and international resolutions. But for those who traced it back to its source, it remained one woman's quiet defiance on a lonely stretch of road, where she refused to let cruelty dictate her tone. As centuries turned, the plaque weathered and the road changed shape. But the light still caught those bronze words the same way it always had. Travelers who passed by would stop and read them aloud, almost as if reciting scripture. Every citizen deserves dignity under the law. They didn't always know the story. They didn't need to. The truth was already in the words. Centuries blurred together until names became echoes and events became principles. Borders shifted. Languages evolved. But her story remained anchored in the core of human memory. They didn't call it the Harris Initiative anymore. They called it the Foundation Code. Nations that no longer resembled the ones she'd lived still traced their civic ethics to her words. Scholars spoke of her in the same breath as reformers, philosophers, and poets. Yet unlike most who had written theories, hers had been born from one moment on a roadside, a single act of quiet that changed everything. The photograph had survived every technological shift. Its digital copy, restored countless times, was still clear enough to show the wind in her hair, the small cut above her brow, the unflinching calm in her eyes. No artist ever managed to recreate it faithfully, because the truth behind it wasn't visual. It was spiritual. Academics described the Harris effect as the point where power confronted grace and lost. It became a universal study law. Psychology, diplomacy, conflict resolution all taught the same foundational lesson: how silence could dismantle aggression, how empathy could reset systems. In one distant century, a council of educators and leaders gathered to create a global creed of conduct for all professions. They didn't quote laws or religions. They opened with her line, preserved through generations: power isn't what you hold over people. It's what you choose not to take from them. It became humanity's shared vow, recited by nurses before first shifts, judges before sentencing, officers before duty, teachers before class. No oath replaced it, because no words after hers could refine it further. The road where everything began had long since vanished under new architecture. The town had grown into a quiet metropolis of glass towers and green roofs, yet they preserved that single square of ground. It was called the Garden of Stillness, now a small park at the city's center. Visitors entered barefoot, out of respect. In the middle stood the final monument, made not of marble but clear crystal, etched with only her name, birth and death years, and the line the world had memorized. When the sun hit it, the light scattered like rain across the plaza, reminding everyone who passed that even brokenness can refract beauty. Every generation tried to describe her in its own language. Some called her the Mother of Mercy, some called her the Architect of Empathy. But the historians simply wrote, she was the first to show that calm could be revolutionary. And they were right. Her silence had not been submission, it had been a mirror held up to power, forcing it to confront itself. In the distant future, a young cadet preparing for her first mission sat beneath that monument, reading from a pocket device that contained the complete Harris archives. Her name was Noor, and like the woman she admired, she believed in restraint. Her city was peaceful now, yet she studied those old lessons every morning. When her instructor once asked why, she said, "Because peace isn't permanent, it's practiced." That answer was recorded and added to the living archive of the Harris Institute. That night, Noor dreamed of the roadside, though she had never seen it except in holograms. She saw the flashing lights, the gray sky, the calm face of the woman, who changed everything by refusing to lose herself. When she woke, the words were still in her mind: dignity is the last language that never lies. She walked to the monument before dawn. The air was cool, still carrying the faint hum of city power. She placed her palm against the crystal surface and whispered, "We haven't forgotten." The monument didn't need to reply. It glowed faintly as the first light touched it, scattering reflections across her face. In that quiet, the world felt whole again, as if history itself had taken a breath. Somewhere in that silence beyond time, beyond names, the spirit of Mitchell Harris lingered. Not as a ghost or memory, but as a principle embedded in the fabric of human conscience. The moment she had chosen calm over rage had never stopped echoing. It lived in policy, in compassion, in pause, the breath before reaction, the space where justice learned to listen. And so, in a world unrecognizable from the one she had known, her presence remained steady, wordless, eternal. The road was gone, But the light stayed. The monument shimmered as the sun rose higher, and the inscription caught the morning just as it always had. Every citizen deserves dignity under the law. The words no longer belonged to any country. They belonged to humanity. The wind moved gently through the garden, bending the grass, carrying whispers of gratitude from strangers who would never know her voice but lived in the world she made possible. It was quiet, the kind of quiet she had taught them all to honor, a silence full of meaning, the silence that started it all.